In this report, thank you. In this report, we outline that because this is a quasi-legislative action, the procedures in this action for providing and setting upper payment limits are done through adopting a regulation, through notice and comment, and rulemaking through the Maryland Administrative Procedures Act. And that the cost review study and this newly articulated policy review process that I'll go over shortly, they're both part of this quasi-legislative process that enables the board to acquire the data that they need to set public policy. So again, the cost review process, this policy review process, and the work that happens through this ultimately feed into the policy positions of the board that they'll adopt through the process that we'll go through today. Next slide. So one of the things that
Andy, did you want to take hands during the presentation?
Yeah, for some reason they're not showing up for me, but I'm happy to take them throughout if you want to.
Mr. Johnson has a question.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you want to go through the whole thing or sort of as you go through. On the slide prior, so for the regulatory action or adoption, is it your intention or your thought that you will have be doing regulations before any adoption or final action will be taken around the an upper payment limit action plan if it is adopted?
So there's the upper payment limit action plan. Then there's going to be regulations that outline this process that we're discussing today. So those are going to be regulations that need to be passed. And then each upper payment limit will be implemented through regulation, unless someone from my team wants to tell me that I'm state otherwise. But it is our intention to publish these as regulations and then go through the full regulatory process to set upper payment limits, each upper payment limit.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly Schultz, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I too was waiting to see if you were going to take questions at the end, but if on the first slide you talk about the plan needs to be reviewed by, and maybe it was the next slide, by the legislative committee. So what does that timeline look? And does that legislative committee, do they take those requests throughout the year? Do they have deadlines before the legislative session starts? So what I heard at the last board meeting that there was some urgency to get these in, and I'm just wondering if this is a rolling request and review from that legislative policy committee.
It's a great question. So we have been in touch with the legislative policy committee staff just to see if we can fit into any schedule that they have. And from what we've heard so far, there are no kind of meetings on the agenda, and they have their own specific way that they follow business. I don't have a hard answer on that. It seems like they may be able to do ad hoc meetings, or they may have other ways of doing business. So it's kind of outside of our scope on how the legislative policy committee conducts their business. All we can say is when we will submit it to them, and we also know that they have a 5-day deadline based on our statute. So we'll communicate that information to them, and then ultimately we'll kind of leave it up to the policy committee the legislative policy committee, that we can try to provide updates based on what we hear from them.
So you're saying that in statute, whether or not we give them that information today or 3 months from now, they have 45 days to review and respond to it? That's what the statute says? That's
right. They have 45 days to approve what is submitted to them as our upper payment limit action plan. And then if they do not take action within those 45 days or do not approve it within those 45 days, there's an additional step where the governor and the attorney general can approve it if it's not approved by the legislative policy committee.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. And ultimately, again, it needs to be approved by the board. So nothing's going to be sent to the legislative policy committee until the board takes action. But this is the chance for the stakeholder council to provide input on what the board will be considering.
That was all the hands that were raised at this time.
Great. Yeah, and I think since this is going to be a very complicated and long-winded process, I do encourage folks to kind of ask questions along the way. I think it'd be difficult to save them all for the end. So feel free to flag. Okay, so the report outlines proposed criteria for setting an upper payment limit. I think I'll let folks review that. I guess I can go through all of them, but the proposed criteria for setting an upper payment limit include considering the cost of administering the drug and delivering the drug to consumers, as well as other relevant administrative costs. I believe that's a statutory criteria. The board will also determine that an upper payment limit is an appropriate tool to address the drivers from of the affordability challenge identified for the prescription drug product. So we'll go over that in just a moment. The board will set an upper or shall not set an upper payment limit for prescription drugs if the utilization for the eligible governmental entity is minimal. The board shall set an upper payment limit in a way to minimize adverse outcomes and minimize the risk of unintended consequences. I am going to go back to this point in particular because it does seem like a number of the public comments we've received have questions about that specific issue. So I'll just provide a little bit more detail in just a moment. The board shall prioritize drugs that have a high portion of out-of-pocket costs compared to the net costs of the drug. So again, if a patient is paying a disproportionate share of the net cost of drugs, that can be a priority for the board. The board shall not set an upper payment limit for generic prescription drugs that have 9 or more marketed therapeutic equivalents. The board shall not set an upper payment limit amount that impacts statutory or regulatory amounts, such as Medicaid best price. And then finally, the board shall not set an upper payment limit that is lower than the Medicare maximum fair price. And this is relevant because Medicare did announce their maximum fair prices for the first 10 negotiated drugs, I think 2 weeks ago. So these are the criteria that the board has, or the staff has proposed. Ultimately, these criteria can change, or we can add criteria or remove criteria. So I think this is something we're certainly interested in public feedback on. And I'll answer Mr. Johnson's question, and then I'll also address this unintended consequence bullet in just a moment. Mr. Johnson, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so thanks, Andy. So when I went through this was the sort of the slide I wanted to ask probably the most questions about or get the staff's comments or feedback on what you all are thinking. And I assume, given that this is a working document, and I didn't see sort of any additional sort of details around this criteria, that it's perhaps still being in development and stuff like that. So on the first bullet, for cost of administering a drug and delivering a drug, and I know, and you just raised some of the points that the some advocates raised, particularly I know the chain drugstore folks raised. What do you, or how do you define or see administrative costs, particularly, you know, like the pharmacist raised with dispensing fees and stuff like that? How are you all going to address those, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so we are mandated to consider this as part, I think this is a legislative one. So this is something that we'll certainly have to think through. And I would say basically we're going to account for all administrative costs. So there's certainly the dispensing fees from the pharmacy side. On the infused drugs, these were also in our public comments, a lot of questions about infusion costs and things like that. But then I think we even want to go beyond that and look at things like, costs of storing and transporting like specialty drugs. There's often special handling requirements for specialty drugs. So I think that would be either, we expect this to kind of be a section of the report, documenting if there are any, costs that are unique to that drug that need to be accounted for. And then that can be, that would be accounted for as part of the whole kind of upper payment limit discussion. So I hope that answers the question. But we do recognize that certain drugs have additional costs that can sometimes be passed on to patients that are outside of the ingredient cost of the drug. Okay.
On the second bullet, and you've mentioned this often in the past as you have a toolbox, and the UPL could be one item in the toolbox.
Yeah.
So if you have other non-UPL policies, what are some other non-UPL policies that are in your toolbox today that if at the end of the year or early in the year you have one of the drugs that's under review now is determined to be unaffordable, but a UPL process is not set up yet because of the regulatory system that you have to do. What other tools do you have in your toolkit now that you could use, or how would you use that?
Yeah, so the direct authority that the board has is going to be for upper payment limits. But there's a number of policies that we've looked at in documents such as our supply chain report that basically outlines a number of other policies that states as a whole can implement, or public entities. And so what we would see happening here, and I'll go over this later in the presentation, is that the board makes kind of formal recommendations, either to the legislator, or if it's something that can be done in other parts of the executive branch, kind of saying this should be done, right? So then when you talk about that, you're talking about anything a state can do legislatively or otherwise. But you could picture the board saying, here's why this drug's unaffordable. We don't think upper payment limits is the right tool. We think it should be, name your other drug policy. So then the board would then make those as a formal recommendation, either to whatever entity can then kind of do that work, whether it be a legislative action or an executive action from one of our executive partners.
Okay. And then on the third bullet, you say, don't set up a UPL if the government entity is minimal.
Yeah.
What is the staff thinking as minimal? Is that on a dollar basis? Is it on a population basis? What is the thought process there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the general concept that we're trying to get at here is that there is a lot of administrative time and effort that goes into the work of implementing an upper payment limit. So for example, I'll just throw out some hypotheticals. If the corrections system literally does not prescribe any of the drug, we would not force them to use their staff and administrative time to kind of go through the steps of setting an upper payment limit if it's not a tool that they can or would use for the drug that is under consideration, if that makes sense. So in terms of how that threshold would work, ultimately, if state resources outweigh the administrative resources that would need to take the savings that would come through from the process, I think that's the general framework we would use. Though I don't think we can kind of that's at a high level the concept that we're getting at. I think we could be more specific about what that would look like. Yeah.
Do you think the staff, are you? And I'm not trying to get you on the spot or anything. Do you think more if it's in a larger context? Okay, take the context of the state employees, and it's a larger context where something could be done. Do you see it probably being more on a dollar basis, threshold, minimal, max, or on a population, per person, or you just still haven't thought that out yet?
I mean, I don't want to. I don't think we've thought that out yet. I mean, my initial reaction is that it would be probably dollar based, and again, it's a weighting of, does the resources that it requires to implement outweigh the savings that would come from going through the process, basically. So I think that would be kind of a dollar basis would be so the minimal, I think, is a dollar estimate. And
then the last question I'll ask, I'll let other people chime in, and I apologize for taking all of it, but do you anticipate maybe at our next meeting, at our next stakeholder meeting, that you'll have something more drilled down into these criteria pieces for there to be reviewed or discussed as to yes or no, or this is good, or this is better? I mean, are you going to drill these bullets down even more so we have some more context to this, rather than just sort of I look at this as maybe 20,000 foot level?
Yeah, I think this is the time to provide feedback on these. So if you have more specific recommendations than what's outlined in these criteria, we welcome that feedback. I'm not sure if we can commit to more than that, though. We're looking for as much feedback as you can provide, and we're happy to get as specific as.
I guess on that question,
feedback.
on that answer, then it seems as though I haven't seen a lot of feedback based on what we have said a lot, or I have said a lot on these calls. So, are we going to get some feedback from the staff after this call, or after you're able to review all the information that's come in already? And I know probably there's still some coming in by the close of business today that we won't have been able to see or talk about today. But will there be feedback from the staff? So if Darren Johnson had said, I think a threshold, should be 100 people or something like that, you would feedback to Darren Johnson, thank you for the comment, Darren. This is why we disagree, or this is why we agree, or here's what we're thinking about. Are we going to see feedback on all of these discussions and on the comments to know what you all are developing?
Yeah. So I guess in Maryland, it doesn't work the same way that it does in the federal level, where it's like you kind of review each comment and respond to each comment. These are inputs for the board to consider. So the board will read all of these comments and take those comments, right? So ultimately, the way it can work is we will be revising the report based on the comments that we receive, and then staff can incorporate the comments as appropriate, and then the board would then have the opportunity to add that. So, we receive this comment, and then we specify even more, saying that there's some threshold of lives that need to be covered as part of this criteria. We can say that in the report. Then they say, we saw a comment that said it's 100, we should put 100 in. That's how this process would work, is that staff will review the comments, update the report accordingly, or the UPL action plan accordingly, and then the board ultimately kind of can make final decisions and approve it.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
Mr.
I
Lipsey?
did want to, I guess, before Mr. Lipsey goes, I might just flag, because there is one more of these elements on here that we did get some public comments on that I do want to just go through very briefly. We did get a number of comments on the fourth bullet on the left column, that the board shall set up repayment limits in a way to minimize risk of adverse outcomes and minimize the risk of unintended consequences. This is something that we've talked through a lot, and we did receive some comments that basically said, like, what does this mean and how would you do it? And I think at a high level, we'd be looking throughout the process for public and stakeholder input on exactly, what those potential unintended consequences are. And then also the fact that we're actually looking at the drivers of why the drug is unaffordable or has high out-of-pocket costs. The fact that we're kind of looking at that and making a determination that our payment limits are responsive to that kind of market failure or cost driver is another thing that we'll do. And then also we'll just do general monitoring on all of our work to ensure that there's no unintended consequences or issues that were not foreseen. So kind of just a high level, that's what we're looking for. But that's also kind of the hope that the help that we are hoping to get from the stakeholder council and public input is folks identifying these potential issues. And if you read a lot of the public comments that we received up to this point, that's what a lot of the feedback we've been receiving is kind of addressing specifically. So we do look forward to continuing to get that input from the public and stakeholder council and experts. So Mr. Lipsey?
Yes, thank you. I actually want to kind of build on something you just said and something that Darren had said. So much of this seems to have been focused on upper payment limit, and you just talked about the potential of looking at what I would, I guess, characterize as the broader process from beginning to end. And I'm going to speak from a consumer standpoint, and having worked in other industries besides healthcare. What struck me, not only about a lot of these conversations were focused on one thing, and yet the public comment that's been received from various areas, I'm going to say areas of the process, the pharmacists, the PBMs, the whatever. I will tell you, the ultimate question I want to ask is, what is the authority of this board to get involved in all of the aspects? Because as I look at all of this conversation, we're either focusing tremendously on just one aspect, and then the public comment seems to come in and says, I understand all this, thank you very much for doing the work, and it's not my problem, it's the other guys over there. And everybody seems to be pointing somewhere else. And as a consumer, ultimately, to be polite about it, I don't care, because it's an umbrella, all-encompassing sort of situation. My own perspective is everybody's got a hand in this someplace. There are an awful lot of people in the process. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a tremendous number of the elements in the process are all talking about how much they're designed to save money for the ultimate consumer. Everybody's in the process of saving money, but everybody's making a living in the process. And there seems to be a whole lot of people in the middle of all of this. So from a board perspective, what is the opportunity to get all of these people in a room and really hammer this out to figure out how is this entire process beginning to end going to be made a whole lot more effective and efficient so that we're not looking at just aspect A and then some other time we're looking at aspect B and some other, because there is a domino effect. If you do one thing, it's going to affect something else. And looking at this in its entirety seems to be, a critical need in all of this. So I share that and ask, I guess, what is the board's ability to tackle some of this as opposed to doing it by the eaches?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say a great question and great comment. Okay, so just one, the board, I think, is very interested in looking at the system as a whole. I think from the beginning, they've kind of said, it's a number of actors working in a very complex system, working exactly to the incentives that are provided to them through that very complicated system, right? And a lot of their work up at this point, including the supply chain report and other reports that they've done, has tried to break down some of those ideas. In terms of very specific authority, the only authority we have is for upper payment limits, though the board can make recommendations to other groups. So that brings up the other thing that I wanted to flag is that the board can do an annual, well, they do an annual report every year. And as part of that annual report, they can make policy recommendations that can help the state save money on drugs. So I think that's one of the forums that we expect to do this, but then also even on a drug by drug basis through this cost review process, we can certainly continue to do that. But I do think that the board, is interested in addressing the system as a whole to address the drivers that we find. This year, the board, I think at the last board meeting, we started to talk through potential kind of broader options for them to consider and address in their annual report. They basically, I think at this point, concerned with staff time and resources. We need to focus on our cost review process and then also standing up our upper payment limit process. But I wouldn't be surprised if in future years they take bites at different apples, like trying to understand different issues within the supply chain and making policy recommendations. Let's see. I'm not sure if that kind of addressed your question. You did flag that, like, let's just get everyone into the same room and.
Well, yeah. I mean, in fairness, I've worked for a while on healthcare, but I've also worked in other industries, and the amount of complexity in this entire process, in everything from manufacturer all the way to dispensing, and I think of it as, yeah, supply chain you can think of it as that way, but I think that may even be too limiting a term. Is probably the most complex thing I've ever worked in. And it's not that I'm not appreciative of the work that the entire team is doing. I am, or else I wouldn't be serving on the stakeholder council. But the longer I'm sitting on this, the more I think it cries out for looking at this in a much more holistic sense. And if work needs to be done on a policy basis, if somebody needs to dig into this, because I know it's a lot more than just the state. I know it's national level. But I am constantly amazed at how much work goes into making very small progress. The talk of entrepreneurialism and incentive, great inventions and process improvements in healthcare. When I first got into healthcare, which is 15, 17 years ago, in many aspects of healthcare, they're still talking about the exact same things. And I look at this board as having an opportunity to potentially have at least on a policy basis, to really dig in and make a more substantial impact, because it's not just the eaches, but it's a holistic question. So.
I'll provide two other quick comments. So one, I would just say thank you for that comment, and I think we can take that to the board. I would be surprised. I mean, they're the right experts to kind of think through the issues that you flagged. I did want to just briefly address your question about why it's so focused on the upper payment limits portion, right? And that's just because this is the paper that sets up that process. I will briefly talk about how we'll recommend other policies, but it does get short shrift compared to the upper payment limit element. And then,
I mean, I understand that's where
Yeah.
that's the authority that you have. So, you know, the tool you have is a hammer, so the problem is the nail. So I got it.
I would respond to that saying that this paper is describing the hammer and not the nail. Like there is a separate, I mean, we can talk separately about the nail or, you know, the drill versus the hammer, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And with that, I might hand it over to Delegate Cullison for her comments.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And Mr. Lipsky, I agree 100% with everything that you said. However, as you also said, this is really a national issue. The complexity of the chain, as you described it, will not be dealt with in any comprehensive way unless it begins at the federal level. And, you know, as the policymaker who created the board and the stakeholder council, we were looking for something that we could use that would be, you know, an instrument to help us clarify this process, to see where the leverage was in different parts of the process. And it seemed, you know, we ran into issues with the FTC, with, you know, the rules around competition, all of that. So
No, please don't misunderstand. I'm not naive about all of that. I understand that. I'm kind of sharing a thought, in part because I'm also aware that Maryland has been a leader in many aspects. It's got the waiver for reimbursements. So I see it as, you know, this state, you know, has been willing to tackle some issues, get ahead of the curve, try things. I'm fully cognizant of the fact that this is a national issue, and I'm not trying to say Maryland can solve this without, you know, there being federal or, you know, changes on a federal level kind of thing. I just see that we have the opportunity to think through and maybe even help this process someplace.
And I would suggest that I think we are doing that. There is a lot of discussion at the board level around all of the different components and complexity. But the fact that we were the first state in the country to pass, to put the board into existence, and a number of states have picked it up, it begins to put pressure on the industry and on the federal government to do something. So I think that while I appreciate what you're saying, and I honor the work that the board is doing, and know that the members of the board are interested in the same thing that you are, Mr. Lipsky, in terms of trying to deal with the entire issue. We're using the hammer that we have right now, and in order to put the first nail into what will be a long-term process over time. So I thank you for you know, looking at the process in this comprehensive way, and saying that, you know, we want to look at it more broadly, but we have to start somewhere. And this, I think, is where we need to start, and we need to do it sooner rather than later. So thank you, Andrew. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Delegate Closson. And one thing I've noticed, just based on, you know, I wanted folks to ask questions throughout. It may have been helpful for me to try to give an overview of our process, only because I think it will actually answer some of the questions and concerns that folks had brought up. I think both Mr. Lipsky and Mr. Johnson kind of had questions on, like, where does the UPL fall in the overall kind of policy considerations of the board? So I might briefly just walk through that before we dive into other questions, if that's okay. Go ahead,
I just want to say thank you, and I didn't mean to derail your presentation.
No, it was good conversation. Thank you. Go ahead, Christina.
Andy, Sean Brown just had one question in the chat. Do you want
thank you.
Do you want to address it now or wait till the end of the presentation?
No, I can answer this one. This one's pretty quick. Sean, thanks for sending this answer. And actually, this is something we would certainly welcome public comment on. So the general idea for that criteria is that we wouldn't need to set an upper payment limit if a drug had some number of therapeutic equivalents, i.e. generics. So you want to make sure that we're careful with that language. And basically, we were referring to that shark fin where it basically shows, I think, like 5 generics. You kind of reach peak impact of generic competition. The reason we picked 9 is because there can be challenges where if some of those producers have production issues or anything like that, then you may just not reach that full market competition saturation threshold. So we welcome folks, if there's a better way to come up with criteria there, we welcome that feedback. But the general idea is like a drug that has 9 generic competitors is at full market competition, and the market forces are working the way that they should. So that's kind of how we came up with that number, and that's why we had that as one of the criteria. But if folks have a different threshold or a different definition there, I think we would certainly welcome that. Okay, great. So I'm going to try to briefly go through this process. And as you can tell from all of our processes that we've set up, I guess briefly is going to be a relative term. So this slide should look familiar. This basically is the first half of our cost review process. So this is what you've already seen, the identification of drugs. So I've talked about that a number of times, so I won't go through that again. Then the selection of drugs. We know that our board selected 6 drugs for cost review. The important slide is this next slide, because this is what's being adjusted through the upper payment limit action plan. So everything remains the same through the analyze phase, right? So you have your drugs in cost review. We have our comment periods, data collection, the RFI. We'll go over that in the presentation after this. The analyze, staff is taking all the information that comes in through the cost review study process and providing that to the board. Before we talked about this, this action plan, it went straight to final results. The board would take that information and then make their determination of if drug caused affordability has led or will lead to affordability challenges or high out-of-pocket costs to patients, right? What this process is doing is now adding 2 kind of intermediate processes there. The first one is this, the preliminary determination. So we're now adding a step where the board is going to make a preliminary determination that the drug has led to these affordability challenges. And I'll go into depth on each of these shortly. But basically what this does is it triggers this next process that we're talking about, which is our policy review process. So at a very high level, the board is saying, we think this drug has affordability challenges, whether that be high cost of the healthcare system or high out-of-pocket costs for patients. So we need to figure out why it's having those issues and then propose policy solutions to try to address those. So that's kind of this new process that we've added as part of the UPL action plan that was not originally in the initial cost review process. So there's these 2 additional steps that we'll start to flesh out throughout this presentation. Next slide. So again, just the general updates is the board will take the information from the cost review study process and then make a preliminary determination of whether or not the drug has led or will lead to affordability challenges for the state. And then that preliminary determination is non-final and subject to revision or modification. And the way that would work is the board will be drafting a preliminary determination report. We can take public comments on that preliminary determination report. And then ultimately it would be finalized as a final cost review study report that is the kind of final work product of the cost review study portion. Next slide.
So
now go ahead, Derek.
Can I ask just a real quick question there?
Sure.
So at the end of that process, if at the end of that process, it is a final determination of unaffordability, I assume then you kick into the UPL policy review process.
We'll walk through that. They actually happen at the same time. So if you look at this slide, the way that we're looking at it is the board makes their preliminary determination, and then it almost starts kind of 3 interacting but separate, well, not necessarily even separate, but 3 separate processes. One is the finalization of this cost review study, right? So theoretically, as part of this process, we can just get more information where they change their mind and say, actually, this doesn't cause any affordability challenges. So there is this, like the red column or the red row at the bottom is the finalization of your cost review. So right now there's a preliminary determination that basically says we should look into this more and think about policy options. And then at the end, they will say, we make our final determination that this drug is unaffordable as part of this final report. Then in the blue, is our other policies. So we call that basically our non-UPL policy review process. So again, once the board makes a preliminary determination, then they kind of open up this next step where they start thinking through, okay, drug has affordability challenges. How do we address those affordability challenges? And we can do it through the blue way, which is all the non-UPL policies, and then the green way, which is much more built out, which is if we are going to set an upper payment limit, here's how we go about doing that. So all of those kind of happen in parallel and kind of, again, in interacting ways, but ultimately the final determination and the policy recommendations, and if they're setting an upper payment limit, the upper payment limit process all end at the very same time, where they approve the final report, has the policy recommendations from the board, and sets the upper payment limit if they decide to set an upper payment limit.
But how are you, the board doesn't have any, that's why I asked about these non-UPL
Yeah,
options.
it's a good question.
The board doesn't have that authority. The
Right.
board would have to ask for the legislature to do, I'll make it up. We want all injectable medicines to have a $5 copay. That would solve this issue for drug X. I'm just making it up.
Yep.
That would have to be recommended to the legislature. Legislature is only in for 90 days. So is the staff thinking only these policies are sort of going to be put in place towards the end of each year? Because if you do something in the middle of the year, you don't have that authority.
I mean, that's correct that legislative recommendations would be addressed by the legislator when they're in session. I don't think it's necessarily limited to that. You can picture novel contracting arrangements. We recommend that our health department engage with blah, blah, but to your point, they're all recommendations, right? I mean, we could theoretically ask for additional authority to do things, but I think what I would, what's been discussed up to this point is makes recommendations. So it would be kind of, resolutions in a board meeting. A board votes on this resolution that says we recommend that the legislator pass the legislation that you just mentioned, or we recommend that the Department of Health or the Insurance Administration, promulgate regulations that do this to address this issue, right? So they are ultimately, all the non-UPL things are all policy recommendations. That's correct.
So there could ultimately be a time lag between this A&E decision and then an ultimate sort of, I'll call it an adjudication. So, I mean, if you recommended something, as you just said, health department do novel contracting or MIA do X, that may take several months, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
And so if something was done in January, a vote of the board on drug X, we want to do these novel things, that may take 6 or 7 months. The board, I mean, then what happens if that can't happen?
I mean, ultimately they're recommendations, right? So they need to be implemented through other mechanisms. But what can happen is board goes through the entire process and their final recommendation is we're not going to do a UPL. We make these recommendations, but we do find the drug had caused affordability challenges, right? Like, so those are all kind of ways that this process could result,
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. And so that takes us to this next portion. So I'm going to continue to try to just walk through this process through each of these slides. But again, there's the 3 high-level processes. So which we just talked about is again, the cost review study process. There's now a preliminary determination. We'll put out a preliminary determination report for public comment. And then ultimately there's going to be a final report that makes the final determination of the board on if the drug causes affordability challenges. Next, we'll briefly go through we'll start the policy process, briefly talk about the non-UPL policy process, and then spend a lot of time talking through the UPL development. So basically at a very high level, there's these 3 steps for this policy review process. So again, this is separate from the cost review report. First, there's optional information gathering. And the general idea here is that the board will be collecting the information they need for their cost review. That may not be enough to actually address a lot of one way we've been thinking about it is like the cost review says the what. It says, yes, we saw these numbers and they cause affordability challenges, but it doesn't necessarily address the why or how, which is the, like, why are these numbers, like, why do these affordability challenges exist and what policies can you use to address those, right? So that's what we're going to try to address in this information gathering portion, which is to gather more information to answer questions that we weren't able to answer based on the information from the cost review study process. Again, this is optional. It'll kind of be up to the staff and the board to determine if they did not get enough information from the cost review study. Then the next step is for the staff to recommend policy options. And as part of this process, we will identify the drivers or our perceived understanding of the drivers of the affordability challenges, and then the policy options that we think will address those drivers. Like, why is this drug unaffordable? And then here's the policies that address that specific issue that make that drug unaffordable. And you'll see that we map it out in two different ways. There's the non-UPL policies and then the UPL policies. And then there's ultimately the final action. So these are 3 steps: the information gathering, staff recommendations on policy options, and then the final actions of the board, which is the adoption of the affordability challenge report and the determination of the affordability challenge. And then also the adoption of non-UPL policy recommendations. And then also, if they decide to do a UPL, the proposed regulations setting the UPL at that specified amount, or we can do both. It can be some policies that are not UPLs as well as a UPL. So that's the ultimate high-level process, but we're going to try to go into the weeds, kind of walking through each of those steps. So there's the policy review, or sorry, optional information gathering. And again, this is just if the board and staff decide that there's additional information needed to answer the questions that we're trying to answer when we're making policy recommendations. So we will look at the information that's available and then determine if we need additional information. And then we've created basically kind of two new tools, but then also these other input sources on collecting that information. So there's informational hearings, which I think just at a high level. So all of these will kind of be fleshed out in the regulations on the actual processes and things like that. But the informational hearings are supposed to be kind of more of a general content from like a large audience providing their input and feedback. We also have expert testimony hearings, which are going to be much more specific and much more technical, where we actually kind of direct questions to kind of invited experts to work through specific issues that the staff or board is trying to work through. So I think both of those tools will always be available. We'll also continue to go to the stakeholder council for your expert input. And then board staff will continue to do different research and analyses. And then once we're starting to think about upper payment limits, we'll also want direct input from our eligible governmental entities. So we want to be able to directly work with them and get their input. Ms. Schultz, go ahead.
Hi, sorry about that, Andrew. I just want to
Yeah.
make sure that I'm considering the right thing on this. This is if additional information is necessary during that information, and that's the original information gathering. Is that above and beyond the request for the additional 30 days that the company would
yes,
have?
that's
How
different.
does that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So the way that this would work is like we will go through the full RFR process where we are right now at the cost reviews. And then so this whole process is going to continue to go as it normally would. And the new outcome, instead of saying just making a final cost determination, we're saying we're making a preliminary determination, right? So the RFI still, it needs to be completed before the board can make that preliminary determination. And then when they make the preliminary determination, they'll have to look at all the information they've received and decide if they can answer those high-level questions that I mentioned before, like why are these drugs unaffordable? If they think they can answer that, maybe they don't need additional information, but it's kind of a different question than what the cost review study is asking. Again, that's the what. Is this drug causing affordability challenges or high to the healthcare system or high out-of-pocket costs for patients? You can kind of like look at the numbers and make that assessment without actually understanding why that drug may have those challenges, right? So this next step is to look at what we have and decide, do we know the what and why? And if not, try to gather more information. So that would be, again, through, if we do decide we need more information, it would be through informational hearings or board and text, expert testimony. So it's after the RFI process that you're asking about.
Got it. And this part of the process, this will be spelled out through the regulatory drafting that you're going to be put through?
Yeah, so the regs will talk about like how the hearings will happen,
Okay.
who gets to participate, what is the rules around them. We've heard a lot of things about
Any
Folks-
extensions by on behalf of the company in order to be able to help gather, because the company would
deadlines.
have, I mean, the timeline can't only be set by the board, right? I mean, if the company would have an extended period of time to gather additional information, would they have that opportunity?
I think that's a good question. And I think, so there will be kind of deadlines that we have to hit, but I think we're always trying to give folks, like if folks have information that they want to share, we're trying not to preclude them from doing that. I think my one response is like the board will they will gather information that they can gather and like work through their process. So if we find that they're not able to get the information, that's not going to stop the process. But if we find out that someone is still trying to get information to the board, I think they would try to be flexible there. But again, I don't even think that would be kind of mapped out in the regulations. I think what's going to be in the regulations is like who, how these hearings are announced, who can participate, that kind of thing. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Andy, this is your friendly lawyer.
Yeah.
These are not adjudicatory hearings, everyone. These are quasi-legislative information gathering hearings.
Yeah.
So this is not a, evidentiary hearing. You bring in your experts, all that sort of stuff. That is not the structure of these. These are, for the board to receive information to help inform the setting of policy. So just, keep that in mind. This is not an evidentiary hearing that's being contemplated. But there will be, as it says in the draft, there will be regulations explaining, whatever the mechanisms are for scheduling these hearings.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. I think I misunderstood the question. Thanks. Okay. Great. So that's the optional information gathering, and I will try to move. I know we're already an hour into our meeting, so I think I'll try to move as quickly as I can. Next slide. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Stay on this one. So again, the next step for the staff is to identify the drivers of the affordability challenges. So again, the factors that are causing the phenomenon of an affordability challenge. And then based on that, there are the two policy steps. There's the recommendations around, we'll propose the policy recommendations that are non-UPL policies, and then also it's a and or an or for upper payment limits. So again, what the staff will be producing at that point is a work product that says, here's what we identified as the affordability challenges. Here's the policies we think that can work. Some of them are going to be non-UPLs. UPL may be one of the policies. And we would publish those recommendations for public comment. And this would all be before the board kind of even reviews this. So this is kind of like a staff work product that we can then get public comment on. We would be interested in feedback on whether or not we got the drivers right, and then also whether the policies that the staff is recommending, adequately address the drivers that we've identified.
So Andy, just real quick.
Yep.
You said you're going to publish the policy options. So, do you envision publishing, drug X? No UPL recommended, policy option A recommended.
Yep.
That would go out for public comment, and
Yeah.
public can comment on that. So you could have a whole bunch of people saying, no, we disagree.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, if we would go to the next slide, this kind of fleshes it out. This happens for both processes, but we can kind of show how it would work. This is actually, I think, the only slide we have on the non-UPL policy process. But basically, again, we would put out, we identified the drug, these are the drivers of the affordability challenges for this drug. So we recommend, these three policy recommendations. And then as part of that, we would also want to describe how the policy addresses the driver, the strengths and weaknesses of each policy, information regarding the possible implementation of such a policy, and then also the potential impacts of the policy option as well. So we want to have a pretty fully baked out kind of recommendation for the board based on the analyses that we've done, we will have done, and then also, and then we'll want the public to be able to comment on all elements of that. It's an opportunity for the public to say, you forgot about this policy, or you should take this policy off and replace it with this policy, or all of those things. I think we want to do that's what we're hoping to get from the public comment process and public input process. One thing that I should flag, going back to the information gathering, the tools that are outlined in the information gathering, we kind of frame it as one step. It's a chance for us to get a bunch of information before we make the policy recommendations. but we can also use those tools at any point throughout. So say we make some policy recommendations, seems like we missed the mark, we can then go back to some information gathering around specific policies if necessary. So did just want to flag that at any point we can use any of the kind of information gathering tools that I mentioned. Okay, so that's for the upper payment limit policy process. Now I'll talk through the upper payment limit, which is much more kind of in depth, just because we want to make sure that we're giving the public adequate opportunities for input and comment. So the next thing we would do is for that same analysis that we do for all those other policies, we would do the same analysis for upper payment limits. So we would first identify the drivers of the affordability challenges, and then propose a UPL option, which may include the analysis of the contextual issues related to the driver. So, how do we think this upper payment limit would address the drivers that we've identified? Again, the ability of the UPL to address that issue, any kind of relevant regulatory criteria, and then also we'll also look at the use of the drugs by the eligible governmental entities. Again, looking at, are we even using these drugs in the programs that are UPL. Next slide. So then basically, so after the staff recommends the UPL as a policy option, the staff can also recommend methodologies and factors to establish an upper payment limit. And this is something that would be also available for public comment. This could happen at the same time that last document that I just mentioned happened, or it can happen subsequently. But basically what can happen, just going back to Mr. Johnson's example, board identifies drugs, identifies that this drug is high cost because inadequate market competition. Staff recommends these 3 non-UPL policies, and staff recommends an upper payment limit. As part of that, we can also then recommend the methodologies and factors for setting an upper payment limit. So again, this is almost like the framework you would want to consider. It's not a specific amount at that point. It's again like, this drug has plenty of reference price drugs. We can use a reference price methodology or something like that to set the upper payment limit. So then there's going to be a opportunity for public comment there. There's also going to be a board meeting where the board gets to weigh in on that. Then after that, and I'll go through this again, I'll kind of reiterate this a couple times. After that step, board would then say, staff, we've seen these public comments. Here's our feedback to you. We think you should do, this methodology, a blend of reference pricing and, cost effectiveness or something like that. And then we also want you to think about, these factors, and I'll go over factors and methodologies in just a moment. But that we'll get that kind of guidance from the board. And then the staff is then going to go to B, which is the actual calculation of those methodologies. So we basically get the input from the board. So then we will take that input from the board and then actually do the calculations. So the staff will perform the calculation and will produce a document that shows the actual numbers and then the methodologies and the calculations. And then that will also be subject to public comment. So that will be published as a draft document. And this is an opportunity for folks to, talk about the different things that we're considering, whether or not we did the calculations correctly, weigh in on the assumptions. Folks can propose their own kind of competitive calculations. So this will be a pretty robust public comment process, because we'll want to show our work on this and allow people to comment on our work, and then also propose alternatives. So that's this B step here. Depending on what that feedback looks like, the board may also have an optional technical hearing. And basically the purpose here is for the board and the staff to work through very technical specific issues with key stakeholders. So, if the staff has technical questions about an alternative methodology that was proposed, say, a public commenter says, I think you should scrap your UPL, you should do the UPL this way because of this, right? The board will have the opportunity to convene technical hearings to actually work through some of those technical challenges, if relevant. Based on that technical hearing, the staff may update the calculations on the upper payment limit amount. If there are any updates from the previous version that the public had the chance to comment on, there will be an additional opportunity for public comment. So there's always going to be a version of public comment on any kind of version that would go before the board for final action. And then if you go to the next slide, basically then after this whole process works itself through, it can then go to the board for final action. So you can see that there's a lot of opportunities. There's kind of like, again, the steps we lay out here. Staff says, at high level, here's our recommendation. And we recommend using this methodology, considering these features. Public comment, board meeting where the board tells us what to do. Staff then performs calculations based on the input from the board and the public. We publish our results for public comment. And then again, if there's any changes from a previous version, we would then allow for additional public comment. And then again, the board can convene technical hearings to work through any technical issues. Once there is a final version that is published, that would then be available to the board for final action. So sorry for the long-winded way of saying that. I'm not sure how to make that process much more clear, but I think at a high level, we just want to make sure that the board is providing input throughout the way and the public is allowed to kind of weigh in throughout as well. Next slide.
Andy, real quick,
Yep.
what's your best estimate of the full time frame of what you just went through?
It's going to be variable. It kind of depends on the level of analysis that the staff needs to do. So like if the board says you need to do a full comparative effectiveness analysis and compare it to this, and that, and calculate it with this methodology, that can be very resource intensive and time intensive. If the board says, oh, here's this reference price, we recommend a reference price methodology and these prices are already available to you, that's something that, could theoretically take less time and resources just because the staff wouldn't have to put the same level of analysis in. So going to the next slide. So I'm just going to walk through each of these steps a little bit more. I kind of went into them a little bit more in depth than I meant to, but just going again through each of those steps. First, the staff is going to recommend methodologies and factors. Again, we're going to post those recommendations to the board's website prior to the meeting and then request public comment. Staff is going to present the recommendations to the board, and then the board is going to direct the staff to actually make the calculation based on the methodologies and factors. So again, this is kind of a high level framework of like, here's how we think you should do this. And then we'll kind of take the next step. So if you go to the next slide, it goes to B, where the staff will actually, here's some sample methodologies. So just as an example, staff, identifies this cost driver, there's a number of good domestic reference prices. So staff recommends domestic reference upper payment limit, but then also, we should also just look at the general cost effectiveness. Like that could be a recommendation of the board. The board can then tell us to do that, right? So then we also have a number of different factors on the next slide, and I don't want to read through each of these, but these are kind of like, I don't even want to call them adjusters, but things that the board would want us to account for in any kind of upper payment limit calculations or recommendations that we're making. So we're certainly interested in input on whether or not these factors are useful or not, or if we're missing any. But this is again kind of I guess adjusters is like a lay way to do it, but like you are doing this like overall methodology calculation, but then you want to make sure that you're accounting for these things as you apply that methodology. So these are the things that we're asking for from the board in that first meeting of like, use this general methodology and don't forget to consider, different factors such as the ones that are on this list. Next slide. Out of that board meeting, we expect the board to ask us to perform those calculations and analyses. We've been using the term market basket, and we have gotten some public comments saying that that's probably not an accurate term. I think what we're trying to communicate through that is that theoretically the board can ask us for multiple values on multiple methodologies and then just kind of see what that produces, and we would be able to provide that to them, right? They say we want reference price that considers this and a comparative effectiveness analysis that considers this. Like we would then produce both of those numbers to the board. We would also then take the information that we've calculated and make a specific recommendation for a UPL amount. And then again, we want to provide a very in-depth description of the calculation analysis to make sure that there's robust opportunities for public comment. I think we want to make sure that we would do any of this correctly, and we definitely want to make sure we take full advantage of the public input and expertise that may be available. Next slide. I already mentioned this, but the board may convene technical hearings to receive additional technical input and information. And this is generally, again, going to be in response to written technical comments that come in. So if the board has trouble understanding or has questions about or would like to get more information on anything that's submitted through written comment, we can host these technical hearings to kind of work through some of those specific issues. And again, this kind of hearing will also be outlined in the regulations, just to make sure that we have the regulations governing how those technical hearings would work. Next slide. And then based on all of that, the staff can then update that calculation to the upper payment limit amount. So we can modify or amend the public version. If we do modify that, we want to also make sure that there's additional opportunities for public comment. So, we would publish another draft based on the feedback that we've had, any guidance, any changes that we feel like we need to make based on input, and then publish that for public comment as well. Next slide. And then ultimately, the outcome of all three of these parallel processes that were happening is that the board will be able to take final action on the cost review report. So there's the actual adoption of the final cost review report and the final determination of the drug causes affordability challenges, as well as the different policy recommendations. So that can be the adoption of non-UPL policy recommendations as board resolutions, and then also approval of the proposed regulations for setting the UPL at a specified amount. So again, that's all going to happen in a board meeting. It's our intention and general plan that all these would generally align to happen in one meeting, though it doesn't necessarily have to happen that way. Ultimately, the cost review determination needs to be finalized before you can make policy recommendations, but theoretically, if those policy actions don't happen in the same meeting, they don't have to. I think the way we're planning it is that we want all of those to happen in the same meeting. Next slide. So that is that very complicated representation of what is also a very complicated process. Again, we've tried to design it so there's maximum opportunities for folks to provide comment throughout the quasi-legislative process as the board creates their policies and implements their policies. But I think we're proposing that we err on the side of allowing folks maximum opportunities to provide input. In terms of immediate next steps, so we're excited to get any comments that the Stakeholder Council has now. We've also published the draft of the working document, and we've asked for public comments to come in today on the document itself. So we're taking Stakeholder Council input now. Stakeholder Council has received some public comments, and then also we can receive public input on the draft. We will then publish a final version of the upper payment limit action plan for a board meeting, hopefully incorporating all of the public comments that we've received. If the board in an open meeting can then approve the upper payment limit action plan, and then it would go before the Legislative Policy Committee. They have 45 days to review. If they do not approve, then the Governor and Attorney General may approve the upper payment limit action plan. But that action plan ultimately needs to be approved before we can start the work of setting upper payment limits. So that's the overview, not necessarily a 20,000 foot overview. Mr. Gutman, go ahead.
Well, I would first wanted to congratulate the staff for this very wonderful document that lays out the whole process and for thinking through all the ways you can save time. But I'm still worried about time, and particularly the times for the whole processes. Now, we got the board meeting September 10th. The Legislative Policy Committee ideally would get a document after that. If it gets too much after that, then we run into problems with the session. So what can the Stakeholder Council do, if not today, and I understand today is just getting the information, can we have a vote before September 10th that will enable the board to take action on September 10th?
I don't think there's anything. I think what's most helpful from the Stakeholder Council right now is just robust feedback, making sure that we have a strong document that the board would be willing to approve. So I think that's kind of the key role for the Stakeholder Council at this point. And I think, again, the way the process is designed is to allow for flexibility in terms of how the board wants to set that upper payment limit. So there is a extremely time and intensive resource intensive process if the board wants us to, hire consulting firms that, do modeling, et cetera, come up with de novo prices out of nowhere versus, more streamlined ways to do that. And this process allows for all of those options. So I would say there's probably no additional action from the Stakeholder Council at this point, besides just robust comment and feedback. But I think staff is, whoever listened in on the last board meeting, I think heard the board's strong urgency for us to move the process forward as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Yep.
Darren Johnson.
Yeah, Andy, along those lines, and I had questions about this slide as well. And I was at the last board meeting, but I cannot imagine that the board would be able to make a final decision on this upper payment plan in the next 2 weeks, given all of the comments I'm sure that you all have received for the staff to try to go through. There's comments that the Stakeholder Council we have not seen yet that are going to come in. I assume we'll get them this week, because you guys are really good at getting them out. But then that leaves about a week to comment on an issue that is so significant that some other states have put it on pause, and other states have a lot longer runway process than what this is. Is the staff going to submit to the board on the 10th of September the final upper payment action plan? And is it the staff's belief that the board will vote that on the 10th?
It's a great question. There is a meeting scheduled for the 10th. I think the thing I would say is that this action plan implements the process that, like, we would still need to go through the entire process. And as you probably heard from what has now been an hour-long presentation, it's a very robust process, allowing for ample opportunities to provide public comment. So I would say comments on the action plan itself, again, that's just like the process, right? Then there's you actually have to go through the process, and we expect a lot of robust comment and substantive comment throughout that as well. So I think the feedback that we're looking for as part of the upper payment limit action plan is this process robust enough to allow input from all the necessary stakeholders as they work through identifying policies to address affordability challenges, including potentially setting an upper payment limit. So that is something we've been talking about for 2 or 3 years now.
Well, I understand that, but for the Legislative Policy Committee to adopt an up or down vote on an upper payment limit action plan without having the specifics, the underlying specifics of what you have here, but then the specifics beyond that, seems to me that they're going to be voting on something that is not complete if they don't know what those underlying metrics are, what the underlying criterias are. Some of the questions I asked earlier, is that going to be part of the action plan, or is that just going to be waited for at a later time and date?
They would be implemented through the process that we're outlining here. So we welcome those comments, and I think that's certainly the board would want to hear and consider if they are thinking about approving the upper payment limit action plan. There's nothing that requires them to approve it in an upcoming meeting or the most immediate upcoming meeting. They can do it in a subsequent meeting. So I think that'll ultimately be a board decision, but certainly welcome that feedback if you'd like to share it.
Thank you.
Glenn Schneider.
Andy, I think that the process that you've laid out comprehensively from the very beginning is at a point where it's ripe enough to be started. There's still multiple opportunities, as you said, as you go through the process, for folks to be able to give their input and make sure that the end result is what we're looking for. I think this starts the process. I think the delays have been long enough. I think it's time to get rolling on this for the benefits of everybody in the state, anyone who uses prescription drugs and needs them to be more affordable.
Great, thanks for the comment. Yep, and we'll pass all those on to the board. I think these are all important considerations for the board as they work through this, and then ultimately, the Legislative Policy Committee will also be reviewing this document and just, determine if it meets the needs that they have. Great. Any other comments or questions on this? So as Mr. Johnson laid out, there is, pretty aggressive timeline. So there is a board meeting scheduled for September 10th. I think the agenda has been posted, so this is certainly something that's on the agenda. That doesn't necessarily, the board may determine that they need additional time. We would post any materials for that meeting within at least a week ahead of time. So we'll be taking in all the comments on this document and hopefully publishing materials for the board at least by Tuesday, hopefully by the end of this week.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, Mark, I see
Yes,
your
Mr.
hand
Chair.
is up.
Andy and Christina, can I ask that we finish taking the roll call?
Yes, I was just gonna interject and say that
Thanks.
we do have quorum. So there's 5 people that joined us. Sean Brown,
Here.
thank you. Angela Bryant,
Here.
thank you. Greta Kessler,
Here.
thank you. Mark Nicole.
Here.
Thank you. And then Glenn Schneider.
Here.
Okay, so I would like to point out that we do have quorum now.
All right, thanks, Christina. Can I ask, since we have a quorum, that we ask for a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting? Do I have a motion?
Sagrada, motion to approve.
A second?
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any
Well,
opposed?
Aye.
Aye.
I would like to be
Aye.
in the negative. No, this is Darren Johnson, and I want to explain briefly why. Again, I think the minutes are not reflective of the discussions that happen at these, particularly the minutes from last time does not explain why I was objecting to them, and it doesn't even indicate who objected, the 2 no votes. So again, I just, I think that the minutes are inadequate if people are not attending these or not watching them. They just don't get the flavor of the meeting. And then I see here that our meetings were going to be published on the website. That still has not happened. Can the staff give us a time when that will actually happen? Because again, been asking all year, and we're the only PDAB that does not have those meetings available online for people that don't.
Mr. Johnson, the last PDASC meeting was posted. We did make an announcement several meetings ago.
I'm talking about all the previous meetings, all the recorded sessions have not been added to the website for folks to go back and watch if they would like. They're not on the website. I just don't understand why. And it says going forward, stakeholder council meetings will be published on the website.
Going forward.
But they're not even the
But,
last
but
one.
we will continue to discuss that.
I that's fine. So
Thank
I
you.
just am no on the minutes.
Okay, thanks for the commentary. The motion to approve the minutes has passed. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Christina and Andrew to give us a quick update on the cost review study process.
Thank you, Mark.
Christine, I'm happy to take this if you want. And I will keep this very quick based on the last presentation. So very much appreciate the questions and comments in the last presentation. We will, again, keep this one very quick. So we just wanted to provide a quick update on where we are in the cost review process. So we try to provide a quick status update. So just for folks' reference, these are the 6 drugs that were selected for the cost review study process. Next slide. We did want to talk about a series of adopted motions, amendments to the adopted motions that the board went through in the last meeting. In case folks had questions, so the language is on here, and I would say there's no kind of substantive changes to the actions. What those votes were basically clarifications based on how the motions were worded in the original May 26th meeting. So we just clarified that. Just for reference, the original motions classified drugs into groups when it was important that they each be articulated. So we did that in the first motion. Also, there was discussion from the board on how to prioritize drugs in terms of staff resources. So kind of a sequencing of drugs to maximize the efficiency of staff time and resources. So in that, we have the Ozempic, Trulicity, Farxiga, and Jardiance all had their RFI sent out at the same time. And we'll be subsequently sending out the Skyrizi and Dupixent RFIs, requests for information, when staff capacity permits. And again, that was communicated by the board, but was ambiguous in the motions that were made on May 26th. And then finally, the board added a class of drugs as therapeutic alternatives, but it was important to actually list out all the drugs that were included in that list of therapeutic alternatives. So we just clarified that as well. Primarily the insulins. The insulins were added as therapeutic alternatives for all drugs, the Ozempic, Trulicity, Farxiga, and Jardiance. So we published that list of insulins and the board was able to clarify that record. Next slide. So far we've completed the 60-day comment period per our regulations. That comment period started when the drugs were posted. We've also posted our request for information from entities. I think that went out on July 25th. I'll go over that in just a moment. And then the staff is currently working on the dossier of data and analyses that the board would then use for their preliminary or for their cost review study determinations. Next slide. So the written public comments were due on July 22nd, and those comments have been posted and provided to the board. Next slide. Again, we're also in our request for information process. So we sent out requests for informations to different manufacturers, health insurance carriers, HMOs and MCOs, pharmacy benefit managers, and wholesale distributors. Those requests for information were also posted on the request for information was also posted on the website, but folks received direct outreach as well. And that was done, I think, on July 25th. Next slide. So the entities were notified by email. I think all of them were notified by email. We also posted the notice of request for information on the website. Folks that did not receive direct outreach from us, but would still like to, are a qualifying entity and would still like to provide that information, are also welcome to submit information as part of the request for information process. So that's part of why it was posted on the website. And again, each entity has 30 days from the request of information was posted to the website and transmitted to the entity to submit the relevant information. And also folks can request one 30-day extension in writing to the board on or before the expiration of the initial submission period. Next slide. We also, so we sent out the initial request for information on July 25th. We also held a technical assistance call once that request for information was posted on July 31st. And the requests for information are due today, unless folks request a 30-day extension. So we are interested to see what kind of information comes in today. And then we've also received a number of folks requesting the extension. If anyone has any questions or would like to submit information or needs any information from us, we do have an email specific to the request for information process, which is rfi.pdab@maryland.gov. Next slide.
Oh, Andy, I just want to point out that the technical assistance call that we held on July 31st, that meeting is posted on the website.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
If anyone's
that meeting was
not
recorded and is posted on the website for folks that need information. So that's where we are in the process. We are excited to continue to work through the cost review study process and look forward to working with the board over the course of the next few meetings. All right, any questions on the cost reviews? All right, with that, I think I will turn it back over to Christina
Oh,
or the board chairs, excuse me,
Lorraine, I believe
co-chairs.
it's
Thank you.
co-chairs.
Christina,
Yes.
were,
Oh,
Yep,
were you going to finish the update or is it complete?
oh, I can do the administrative update. Sorry for the confusion. The October 28th PDASC meeting may be rescheduled. In the last board meeting, the board mentioned having additional meetings. We want to be able to have the flexibility to support both the work of the PDAB and the PDASC. So the staff will continue to provide updates regarding any meetings that are rescheduled, and we will provide at least 2 weeks notice, if not more, on those meetings. So we will keep you posted on the next PDASC meeting. But as of now, it is still on October 28th. The next board meeting will take place virtually on Tuesday, September 10th. There will be no board meeting on Monday, September 23rd. You can visit the PDAB website for more information. And I believe Andy did previously mention this already in his comments, that the next board meeting is September 10th. As also mentioned, all comments on the upper payment limit action plan are due today to comments.pdab@maryland.gov. And then lastly, 2025 fee assessment invoices are set to be mailed out this week. Payments will be due on October 1st, 2024. So those are all ready for the mail. And I think that that's all that I have had. Andy, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Nothing else from me. I think folks have heard enough of my voice.
And just in response to the minutes, we do try to follow Robert's rules when doing the minutes. So I hope that helps answer that question, Mr. Johnson, regarding the minutes.
Christina, it looks like there's a hand up. Or
Oh,
Lori.
Kelly Schultz.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. And I didn't want to bring this up during the conversation about the minutes, but because I was absent during the last meeting, but I do have a question about the posting of the meetings. And maybe I'm just, this would sound odd, but technically challenged. But if I go onto the homepage of the PDAB board, if you go to the board page, or if you go to the stakeholder council page, is that
Yes.
where you would find a link to the meetings? Like I'm on the stakeholder council page right now.
Yeah, so they're gonna be, so the June 24th meeting is posted underneath. So if you go into 2024 meetings, it's posted underneath the June 24th meeting, June 24th, 2024 meeting. So it says meeting recording. There is a link.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so all of the information from each meeting will be posted underneath that relevant meeting, if that's helpful.
Got it. And that is the same for the board meetings as well. I guess I can just look it up here real fast.
Yes. Yes. So, so the May board meeting, that'll take you to their meetings are recorded through the Maryland General Assembly when we have them in person. So that will take you to the YouTube page, but.
Right. Okay.
It
So
is
for the
embedded
July
there.
22nd meeting, the last one that they had, agenda and meeting materials, written comment packet. There's no
Oh.
link on there.
Oh, actually, if you go up, hold on, maybe I can just, does anyone mind if I share real quickly? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to explain it to you real fast. So the meeting recording on the July 22nd meeting is actually, if you look in the first paragraph, because the meeting will be live streamed here, the link is actually there. And I can go back and like embed that link in the bottom if that's easier for people to find.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, thanks for bringing my attention to that, because I
because I
honestly
looked
didn't
all
think about
over
it.
for it, and no, I did not click on the live stream link because I didn't know that that's where the recording was happening. That was live streaming, right? So
Yeah,
I guess maybe I
I
could,
can
but-
go embed that link in the underneath each meeting.
Yeah, thank you. If you can just
yeah.
make that a little bit more obvious for folks and to have a historical record of that, that would be great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. And thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Sure.
I appreciate it.
Christina, this is your lawyer again. I just wanted to clarify the statement with respect to the minutes. It's actually the requirements of the Open Meetings Act, which require that the actions be recorded, not what is said. The minutes have to reflect each item that the public body considered, the action the public body took, and each vote that is recorded.
Thank you, Michelle. Are
Great.
there any more questions? No, I don't see any hands, Lorraine and Mark.
Great. Thank you, Christina. And thank you everyone for your time and feedback today. Staff will keep you posted regarding our next meeting, and I'll turn it over to Mark.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
A second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Seeing none, motion is approved and we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.